Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. In authoritarian and totalitarian systems run by an autocrat, usually political allegiance outweighs technical competence. Over time, apolitical professional institutions, military, scientific, diplomatic, are gutted of their skilled leadership and replaced with sycophants who rise by flattery and ideological purity. This creates a slow internal rot that undermines both strategic decision-making and operational effectiveness of every organization within the government, including the military. The Galactic Empire suffered greatly from this problem. Even as a young senator, Chief Palpatine attacked the institutions and tried to generate cynicism about the organizations that made up the very fabric of the Republic.
Into the bureaucrats, the true rulers of the Republic, and on the payroll of the Trade Federation, I might add.
Ironically, the individual that he is criticizing here, Grand Vizier Masamida, would become his bureaucrat and actually run the day-to-day operations of the Galactic Empire. One could argue that without him, the Empire would have collapsed a lot sooner. And that's because, in all fairness, Masamida was good at his job. Dictators like Palpatine don't dislike professional competence, it just comes second to personal loyalty. Because oftentimes the professionalism of institutions like the judicial system, the media, financial systems all serve their own professional interests and are checks on the power of those who rule the government. For instance, Palpatine wanted to build a Death Star, which would cost a significant percentage of the Empire's discretionary budget, and probably require the Empire to print tons of credits, causing mass inflation. The governor of the Imperial Galactic Bank has a professional duty to maintain a certain level of inflation so that the cost of goods don't increase too much. They also have to make sure that the job markets are healthy so that people stay employed. In theory, the governor would oppose any monetary policy that goes against his mandate, including printing a lot of money for a giant Death Star. Also, the Imperial Senate, who is in charge of approving the budget, would be against such actions, as their constituents probably wouldn't want their hard-earned money going towards a Death Star, and would probably prefer better infrastructure and services. Or heck, even if you are a military hawk, you probably would rather have better and more practical weapon systems than a giant moon-sized space station. An independent head of the banking system is a good way to make sure that the politicians don't basically do things that are politically expedient but could destroy the galactic economy in the long run. A strong and independent Senate is good at representing the will of the people. These are important checks and balances on the executive branch of government, and for a government to properly run, you do need at minimum a few checks and balances. The problem here is both of these institutions are bad for the political ambitions of Palpatine, and so the Emperor would choose to undermine these institutions as much as possible. And we see all throughout Palpatine's rise to power through the Senate, as Chancellor of the Republic and finally as Emperor, his main focus was destroying all who opposed him and placing sycophants, lackeys, and stooges into these positions. It's a boring story when compared to the lightsaber fights and epic battles that are shown in the movies, but this is the true tragedy of dictatorships. They attack the mundane, oftentimes apolitical professional class that run the day-to-day operations that serve every individual in the galaxy. These are not politicians, they are not media trained, oftentimes they have very little influence, and they dedicated most of their entire life to serving the people and becoming experts in their fields. This makes them very easy targets for despots. And the sad truth is most people in the galaxy won't notice when this professional class is replaced by loyalists and goons. It's only when the symptoms of their absence begin to emerge will people realize something wrong is happening. Surface problems like inflation driving up the cost of goods, collapsing job markets, all of which a smart dictator can blame on some outside force, like some minority group, like those damn Jedi or rebel scum. No group of people is perfect, but especially minority groups, they generally don't have a lot of voice, and so if you can find one negative trait and expand that to cover every individual, limiting the individual of every member of that group, you can easily turn the populace's attention towards them instead of the root problems that are actually causing a lot of these surface symptoms. And nowhere was the destruction of the professional institutions more apparent than in the design of the Imperial Military. Generally speaking, when it comes to choosing and selecting weapons platforms, there's a multi-layered process starting within the military itself, which identifies operational needs. Those needs are then passed on to the civilian leadership of the military, as is the case in the United States. You have the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, things like that. Sometimes you also need legislative approval in the budget to be able to afford these kind of weapons systems. Although sometimes executive orders can override that. And sometimes you can just use a few senators for target practice with turbo lasers to set an example of what happens when you don't listen to the Emperor. It's a complicated process, sometimes too complicated, one could argue, but rarely are designs chosen by the political leadership because, let's be honest, even if they are military veterans, which Palpatine was not, these individuals lack the experience and understanding to actually design these weapons platforms. Especially something as massive and complicated as a city-sized Star Destroyer, which we're going to be talking about in a second. I mean, the sheer amount of systems on board this type of vessel is just staggering. You can't just have one person design everything. And so when Palpatine decided to scrap the perfectly functional Republic Navy, which had ships that had hundreds of years left in its service life, that alone was probably one of the dumbest and costliest things he did, at least up until that point. But that was followed up by an equally stupid decision to base the entire Imperial Navy around the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. It's rumored that Palpatine himself chose the shape of the ship because it reminded him of ancient Sith vessels that he had read about in the manuscripts. This is equivalent to President Sisi in Egypt right now asking his military to design him a modern tank that looks like a chariot because of the historical connection to his country. Or better yet, it's like when Uday Hussein, the brother of Saddam Hussein, equipped the Fedayeen paramilitary forces with Darth Vader-like helmets. There's another Star Wars fan who completely missed the message behind the original trilogy. It was political, guys. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was a ship that followed form over function. It was a weapon of terror drawn up by Palpatine, heavily influenced by Wilhelm Tarkin's doctrine of using fear to subjugate the populace. It's almost as if the ship wasn't designed for military purposes at all, but for oppressing the civilian populace. Heck, you can argue that most of the Imperial military was designed this way, which of course is a big liability when that military actually has to fight in a real war. Now here's the thing, no dictatorship can control every aspect of the government they are ruling. Palpatine's attention span for military design was focused mainly on the Death Star and the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. And even Wilhelm Tarkin's influence only spanned across a few platforms, like the AT-AT. The rest of the military, the real Imperial military, was mostly staffed by professional individuals, especially in the early days of the Empire. These were experts who were essentially trying to fill in the gaps and create a functional military that could actually patrol the galaxy and fight bandits and pirates, which honestly was the main thing the Imperial Navy did until the Galactic Civil War started. But here's the problem, no weapon system exists in isolation. A weapons platform's true value isn't just in its specifications, but in how it fits into wider doctrine and logistical systems. And the one-dimensional nature of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer led to many deficiencies that had to be filled and addressed by other platforms. The creation of the Death Star robbed resources from other more promising programs, like the TIE Defender. One of the bigger problems with the Imperial-class Star Destroyer is, like many Imperial terror weapons, was the size and cost of the platform. It made sense from an economic standpoint for a Star Destroyer to be deployed over a world like Coruscant, which generates tons of tax revenue and has trillions of citizens who need to be protected. But the Imperial-class Star Destroyer was an old-school battleship with extremely limited range. All of its weapons, aside from the TIE fighters on board, were line of sight, basically. The TIE fighters themselves couldn't operate independently, and so the ISD has all of the capabilities of a ancient battleship, which, if you take a look at our own naval history, became obsolete the second the first aircraft carriers were deployed. I mean, these battleships went from centerpieces of a naval fleet to essentially coastal artillery. This made Imperial-class Star Destroyers tactically ineffective and too expensive for most duties, including handling the most important problem that every galaxy-wide government faces in Star Wars, and that is patrolling the peripherals of the galaxy, which are sparsely populated and where you ideally have a lot of smaller, robust ships rather than large, bulky ships that can't be in multiple locations at one time. Now, if you take a look past all the propaganda pieces like the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, you'll start to see the real Imperial Navy. The Gazanti-class cruiser, a small and efficient civilian freighter that was repurposed into a long-range patrol vessel. We've done videos arguing that this was the real Imperial Navy. Cheap, underfunded, and often at parity with local pirates and smugglers. In all fairness to the Imperial Navy, there were brave individuals who signed up for service who were also well-intentioned and wanted to protect these areas from lawlessness, right? Not every person in the Empire was evil. And, they did a decent job with the tools they had, but there wasn't that kind of superiority you would expect from the Empire. That's kind of a myth. Now, another ship I want to focus on today I like to call the real backbone of the Imperial Navy. And no, it's not the 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers or any Star Destroyer. It was this thing, the EF-76 Nebulon-B Escort Frigate, a ship that is ironically more associated with the Rebel Alliance, which, as you can tell, is a huge problem. The EF-76 was more or less designed by the professional class that I keep mentioning in this video, with whatever resources were left after Palpatine's vanity projects robbed the treasury. Like most of the real Imperial Navy, the EF-76 was designed with economics in mind. The EF-76 as an escort frigate was the perfect size to keep expenses relatively limited, but still project Imperial might and dominance in the local area. It was designed mainly for patrolling. As mentioned before, most of the patrol routes that the Empire had to fill with ships were inappropriate for massive Star Destroyers. The EF-76 as an escort frigate was the perfect size to keep expenses relatively limited, but still project Imperial might and dominance in the local area. The EF-76 was designed and developed by Quad Drive Yards for the Imperial Military to fit these needs. And there are a lot of problems with Quad Drive Yards because this isn't just your normal defense contractor that has to bid and compete with other contractors. For all intents and purposes, Palpatine actually destroyed the free market, as that too in some ways was a check on his power. What you have instead is a series of nationalized companies, many of whom were consolidated in the late Republic era by the Sith through predatory mergers and acquisitions where the sellers were oftentimes under duress, not just financially, but physically. The assassination of the entire Trade Federation board might have been seen as a tragedy by your average citizen, but to a lot of corporate boards and CEOs, it was a warning. You also had large corporations that kowtowed to Emperor Palpatine and were extremely loyal and fearful and therefore allowed a certain level of autonomy. Although no matter how much you praise Emperor Palpatine, no matter how many, gold-plated gifts you give him, at the end of the day, Palpatine gets the last choice on whether your company survives or not. KDY was in a unique position where it had leverage. Dictator strongmen like Palpatine typically bully and push around other entities if they perceive weakness. But Quad Drive Yards was more than a shipyard. The executives of this company, a group of ruling families, founded an entire planet to build a planet-wide shipyard. They alone had the ability to produce massive ships like the Executor-class Star Destroyer. They alone had the capacity to scale up production to lower the cost for the Imperial-class Star Destroyer to a reasonable price. They also alone had the capacity to build dozens of these massive battleships at the same time. And through their subsidiaries like Orthana Heavy Engineering, they could even build entire fleets and armies outside the prying eyes of the media and Senate. Thanks to them, the clones had vehicles to ride into Geonosis. KDY didn't just build the ships though, they were an important part of the Imperial logistical network. One of the huge problems with operating a city-sized ship like the Star Destroyer is resupplying it. Very few shipyards in the galaxy are actually capable of handling a ship of this size. And honestly, this topic alone deserves its own video. There is also the need to refit these ships after battles or just regular wear and tear, and no shipyard could do it as fast as efficiently as Quad. As such, KDY wasn't just a shipyard, it was at the heart of Imperial naval logistics. And therefore, Quad Drive Yards executives were a part of Palpatine's inner circle. They had a seat at the table. This means that the bidding process for contracts like an agile escort frigate lacked the transparency you would normally want for creating military platforms. And when you have a consolidated industry or a monopoly over, certain things, you'll see a lot of problems emerge. I mean, take a look at the US military today. I mean, it's very hard for any of our future weapons programs to be created, let alone go under budget. Post-World War II, the US had dozens of prime defense contractors: North American Aviation, McDonnell, McGrumman, General Dynamics, Hughes, Northrop, Boeing, and Lockheed. Also, you got a lot of civilian manufacturing companies like Ford that were also building, tanks and stuff. There was a lot of competition, basically. But dictators like consolidation because, in all fairness, you do get an economy of scales. You get more integrated supply chains and efficiency, and this allows you to really build mega projects like a Death Star. Now, if you take a look at the United States during World War II, most of the heavy hitters like the B-24 Liberator, the P-51 Mustang, the Sherman tank, the Higgins boat were built by multiple contractors. This was thanks to epic coordination at a scale that no other country could achieve. Back then, we were actually the China of the world, unsurpassed in economic and industrial policy and organization. But here's the thing, there are also problems when you have, 4, 5, 6 different companies building the same vehicle and oftentimes switching parts and assembling them together. Early on in its production cycle, the wings of a B-24 Liberator built by the Douglas Aircraft Company might not fit on the fuselages assembled at Ford Motors' Willow Run plant. Quad Drive Yards represents a much more consolidated defense contractor with a lot of political backing. One could argue that they are the Boeing of the Star Wars galaxy. The same Boeing who famously won the contract for the U.S. Air Force's current mid-air refueling platform. They beat Airbus because of national security reasons. The Boeing KC-46 tanker was supposed to be an incredibly important part of U.S. air power projection all over the world. It was most likely used in the recent attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. While that attack was probably not very effective, what is impressive is that American Air Force pilots flew for 37 hours straight most likely from Missouri to Iran, a trip that required multiple mid-air refuelings. This was supposed to be an extremely important project and a relatively simple project. Boeing basically converted an existing commercial 767 airliner to fit the needs for mid-air refueling, and the program of course racked on billions of dollars in cost overruns, and more importantly, it was delayed for several years, kind of harming the Air Force's power projection capabilities. Airbus originally won the contract with Northrop Grumman with their A330 MRTT platform, which is built on a much newer and arguably better platform. But I guess Airbus is European, and we have just this weird distrust of Western Europe in America. Quad-drive yards lacks competition, and it creates a similarly corrupt culture that has been well documented at Boeing. When Quad put together the E-576 platform, there were some serious issues with the design of the vessel. If you take a look at the shape of the ship, it's quite skeletal in nature, very reminiscent of bulk freighters used by the Separatist Alliance during the Clone Wars, which of course were originally designed to carry exterior containers for the Trade Federation. This is a cost-saving method designed to lower material cost and construction costs. You're basically just designing the skeleton of a ship. There's no plating, no armor on the outside, which is crazy for a warship. With the EF-76, you have two distinct modules, an aft engine block with 7 clustered ion engines that could be manufactured independently at scale, and a forward module that includes the majority of the crew compartments and bridge. Separating the engine from the crew compartment makes sense in case of a reactor overload or some kind of other catastrophic failure, but as a result, you also have a very clear weak point that can be quickly attacked that literally separates the ship into two. While Rebel starfighters might struggle at disabling the massive Imperial-class Star Destroyer or even the Archidans-class light cruiser, a holdover from the Republic era, the EF-76 had an extraordinary weakness for a vessel of its size. All it basically took was an ion torpedo to knock out the rear deflector shields, and then a few well-placed shots, maybe with a concussion missile, and then suddenly you're snapping that vessel in half. You're separating the engine from the crew compartments and the bridge and everything else, and to make matters worse, if the EF-76's emergency bulkheads don't deploy in time, you're going to be venting a good portion of the ship into space. To make matters worse, the reactor for this vessel is located in the rear of the vessel, which means aside from emergency power, the forward section of the vessel only has a limited time before life support fails, and so whoever survives the initial decompression will die a slower death from freezing to death or just, not having oxygen. Although if you're a Mon Calamari, I believe the dryness of space will kill you first. And so essentially what we have here is a ship that you can easily disable with a few quick, precise attacking runs, a Rebel specialty. And to make matters worse, because the Nebulon-B was an escort frigate, it rarely had its own picket ships ready to defend against snub fighters. And if you take a look at the EF-76, it might be called an escort frigate, but it really is not well suited to be a picket ship. It definitely is not well built to fight snub fighters. There's a glaring lack of point defense systems on this vessel, a common trait with all quad-drive yard ships, and the design is quite reminiscent of old Republic capital ships, which oftentimes featured a very vertical and thin hull. This gives the EF-76 plenty of surface area on the front, where most of the firepower is concentrated. Ideally, the EF-76 should be used in frontal attacks, where it presents its very narrow front profile to its enemy, where it's very hard to hit, but also that's where the majority of the offensive and defensive capabilities of the ships are located. Using its speed and mobility, the idea is to keep making slashing frontal attack runs on your enemy and preventing the enemy from getting access to your vulnerable sides and rears of the vessel. This works really well if the EF-76 is attacking a larger vessel, like an Imperial-class Star Destroyer. You see what I'm getting to here? So because of the terribly corrupt and idiotic Sith leadership, because of ineffective military leadership paired with corrupt defense contractors who have no competition, and because there's no free media or checks and balances in the Empire essentially designed the perfect vessel to destroy their own fleets. And they made it especially easy for the rebels to capture this ship, well, disable and then capture it. I mean, they don't even have to send Marines on board, right? People just slowly die. It's gruesome. And once they're dead, you could just tow it to a deep space port, make a few welds, and suddenly you have a refurbished escort frigate for free. And that is basically what the rebels did. They stole a lot of these things. And in the early days of the rebellion, this was literally the largest vessel they had available. It should be mentioned that the EF-76 was mainly used as a hospital ship or a command vessel because those same weaknesses the EF-76 had to snub fighters also meant that the ship could be quickly severed in half by Imperial turbo laser fire if a captain is not careful. The rebels did value the lives of their crew a lot more than the Empire, and they probably assessed that these ships were not ideal for direct frontline action, especially when they, literally destroyed these ships in order to take them over. So they that memory probably is very fresh in their minds of people getting vented into space. I hope this little video gives you a better insight in how poor leadership from the top can affect literally everything, from the price of a liter of Maluran Cola to how stable your job is, to even the effectiveness of military patrols that protect the hyperspace lanes, which of course will make your life a lot more difficult because you can't travel. Suddenly, goods that your plan depends on don't reach there because pirates are grabbing things and stuff like that. This is why it's important to be engaged in politics, especially in a democracy, because whether you realize it or not, the culture and style of leadership that is brought into office matters and will affect you in ways you can't even begin to realize until it's too late. Don't wait until it's too late. It's either that or take the coward's way out and buy a beat-up old freighter and live on the run like Solo. You might have the chance to outrun all that nonsense happening in the galaxy. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video about, this tragic story of the EF-76 Nebulon-B Escort frigate and why the rebels took advantage of all those weaknesses. Anyway, I hope you see you next time, and don't forget, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.